In the winter shadows of a world at war, a single idea threatens to redraw the map of power. In 1938, a nucleus is split in a Berlin lab. A calculation on a scrap of paper suggests a chain reaction. A rumor becomes a fear. If the Nazis harness the atom first, they can end arguments and nations in a flash of white light. In America, that possibility is not a plot. It is a deadline. The answer arrives not as a speech, but as a mobilization. Physicists with chalk-stained sleeves, generals with clipboards, machinists whose hands read blueprints like Braille. They will build a machine that is not one machine at all, but a continent-wide organism of minds, rail spurs, power lines, and kept secrets. The parts will have code names. The cities will not appear on maps. Mail will be intercepted, conversations rehearsed, badges checked, and windows rattled with the weight of turbines that never stop. Oak Ridge grows from pasture to labyrinth, swallowing copper so fast the Treasury trades silver bars to wind the magnets. Hanford raises reactors on the Columbia, turning river and desert into a foundry for a new element no one can see. On a mesa called Los Alamos, a theorist with a poet's eyes convenes a colony of restless minds and tells them, "We have to make the physics real, now." Gun type or implosion, lenses that focus shock waves, switches that act in microseconds. Failure is just rehearsal performed in public, and the audience is history. Everything moves on accelerated time. Steel arrives before the paperwork. Designs iterate while the ground is being poured. Men and women take oaths, take trains, take shifts, and take on tasks no school ever taught. They share cafeteria tables and classified dilemmas, write equations beside lathe cuts, carry the weight of what-ifs to sleep and back again. This is the Manhattan Project, an alliance of science, industry, and secrecy attempting the impossible on a deadline measured not only in days, but in lives. 30 frantic months to turn speculation into a device, an experiment into a shockwave, and a race into a result. The clock is running, the hands are moving, and the only way to beat it is to build faster than fear. From theory to alarm, letters, committees, and a green light. It begins with a split and a realization. In December 1938, in a Berlin lab, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann bombard uranium with neutrons and find the chemistry of barium where barium should not be. Across a border, Lisa Meitner and her nephew Otto Frisch do the math. The uranium nucleus has torn itself in two. Frisch gives it a name borrowed from biology, fission, and calculates that each split releases not only energy, but more neutrons. It is a door to a place no nation has ever stood, a self-sustaining chain reaction, a flood of energy in a heartbeat. By January 1939, the news crosses the Atlantic with Niels Bohr, and suddenly chalkboards in New York, Chicago, and California fill with fresh equations. The idea is simple. The implications are not. One man had been waiting for this moment. Years earlier, pacing a London street, Leo Szilard pictured neutrons multiplying like a rumor in a crowded city. One hit makes two, two make four, four make eight, until the whole becomes unstoppable. He filed a patent in 1934 to fix the concept on paper. Now, with fission confirmed, the thought tightens into worry. Germany has the scientists, the industry, and a government that answers to no one. What if they run first? In the spring of 1939, the American response looks like a university problem set. Enrico Fermi and Szilard at Columbia, assemble piles of graphite blocks and uranium, watching for the faintest hint that neutrons can be tamed by the right moderator, a material that slows them to a sweet spot where they are most effective. Others weigh whether the rarer isotope in natural uranium, U-235, can be separated from its heavier twin, U-238. The math says yes, the hardware says prove it. Scientists are not trained to write to presidents, but war in Europe accelerates etiquette as well as physics. Szilard drafts a letter and asks Albert Einstein to sign it. The message is quiet and direct. A new type of bomb may be possible. Nazi Germany has access to uranium ore. The United States should not be caught unprepared. Dated August 2nd, 1939. The letter takes a circuitous path through the summer's distractions and reaches President Franklin D. Roosevelt in October, hand-delivered by economist Alexander Sachs. Roosevelt listens, glances toward the calendar of a world on fire, and says the line that converts theory to policy. This requires action. Action arrives in the form of a small committee with a long shadow. The Advisory Committee on Uranium, chaired by Lyman Briggs of the National Bureau of Standards. Its budget is microscopic, the first grants total a few $1,000s. But its signal is enormous. Fermi and Szilard receive funds to keep stacking graphite, testing whether pure carbon can serve as the moderator that makes a reactor possible. Other groups test heavy water whose hydrogen atoms are the heavier isotope deuterium, because heavy water also slows neutrons without swallowing them. Uranium and heavy water, not talismans, but tools. Uranium is the fuel. U-235 is the spark plug. A moderator creates the conditions where one fission births the next. Get those three aligned, and a controlled chain reaction can be born. Drive that reaction in the right geometry, and you can breed a new element, plutonium, that might be shaped into a bomb even if U-235 proves devilishly hard to isolate. In June 1940, as France falls and Britain steels itself for the Blitz, Roosevelt creates the National Defense Research Committee, NDRC, under Vannevar Bush, a no-nonsense engineer with a gift for cutting through fog. The problem now expands from, is it possible, to how do we organize possibility? The NDRC becomes a clearinghouse for wartime science. Uranium work sits there as Section S1, still embryonic, still starved of resources compared to tanks and planes. Bush sees the bottleneck and asks for more authority. In 1941, Roosevelt upgrades the NDRC into the Office of Scientific Research and Development, with Bush at the helm. The OSRD can fund, direct, and connect laboratories to industry at scale. The fuse is now attached to an engine. Across the Atlantic, skepticism is dying. The British MAUD Committee, a handful of physicists meeting in wartime London, has been chewing through the numbers on critical masses, isotope separation, and engineering feasibility. Their 1941 report is blunt. A bomb is not only possible, it may be built in time to affect the war. They estimate how much U-235 is required, how fast separation might proceed, how an air-dropped weapon could be designed. When copies reach Washington, they cut through the American habit of caution like a bell in a quiet room. The question is no longer if. It is how fast and by whom. By whom is now a coalition. The OSRD's S1 committee is reorganized under Harvard chemist James B. Conant, a Bush ally with a general's mind for logistics. The Navy and Army send observers who will soon become owners. Industrialists, DuPont, Westinghouse, General Electric, and universities, Columbia, Princeton, Berkeley, Chicago, begin to orbit the same problem. Each brings a piece: cyclotrons that can hurl ions, vacuum technology normally used for radios, metallurgical expertise for elements no human has ever cast. The country's best minds weigh separation paths in parallel because time punishes single bets. Electromagnetic separation using enormous magnets to bend ions. Gaseous diffusion that sifts isotopes through barrier after barrier. Thermal diffusion that leverages temperature gradients. Even centrifuges, which look elegant on paper and maddening in practice. No one knows which will mature first. Policy decides not to decide, yet. Build them all until one wins. Meanwhile, intelligence adds a metronome to the room. Reports filter in about German interest in heavy water from a plant at Vemork in occupied Norway. If Germany is leaning on heavy water as a moderator, perhaps because early experiments with graphite failed due to trace boron impurities, then every shipment to the Reich might be a month off the world's peace. British commandos and Norwegian saboteurs will eventually act, but in 1941 this is still a dossier, not a demolition. The point for Washington is strategic. The other side is not asleep. The clock ticks on both walls. On October 9, 1941, Roosevelt meets with Vannevar Bush in the White House. Bush brings the MIUD conclusions, an independent American analysis, and a simple recommendation. Proceed. Present in or around these discussions are James Conant and Vice President Henry Wallace. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall is briefed. The decision that emerges is not a headline, it is a vector. The uranium program will be accelerated, cloaked in secrecy, and crucially, prepared for direct Army management when the time is right. A few weeks later, the attack on Pearl Harbor will turn "time is short" into national doctrine. What makes uranium and heavy water matter is not mystique. It is physics under pressure. Natural uranium is mostly U-238, which does not readily fission with slow neutrons. The slim fraction that is U-235 does. If you can enrich uranium to raise the percentage of U-235, you can design a bomb that assembles a critical mass of that isotope fast enough to outrun pre-detonation. If enrichment proves too slow, a reactor moderated by graphite or heavy water can transmute U-238 into plutonium-239, which fissions readily. Thus, two families of weapons are implied by nature itself, one from uranium enriched in U-235, one from plutonium bred in a reactor. Both require feats that look, in 1941, like science fiction tempered in steel. Separations plants the size of neighborhoods, reactors that sip neutrons like metronomes, metallurgy for elements nobody has machined, instruments that see microseconds as if they were minutes. The committees are not indulging in redundancy. They are hedging civilization. The United States now does something it had never done. It turns basic research into a secret national priority with a single end. Budgets that once fit in desk drawers expand into lines on appropriations bills that never say atom. Code names bloom. The uranium work is still S1 on paper, but in conversation it becomes something else, a project that will need land, power, rail service, and fences, that will need women and men in thousands to perform patients at scale, that will need a brain somewhere safe to integrate designs that change weekly. A scientist can run a lab. A committee can run a program. What the nation is now planning will require an organization that can move mountains and pretend it did nothing of the sort. The green light is not one switch, it is a runway. By early 1942, America formalizes the handoff from scientific committee to Army command. The Corps of Engineers creates a new district named, not for the secret it holds, but for the city on the letterhead, Manhattan. The pieces are in motion, the roles are set, the questions are painfully clear. Which enrichment path will deliver kilograms, not grams? Can a reactor be made to behave like the equations say it should? Where will the fuel come from, the power be drawn, the secrecy be enforced? What can be built in months that would normally take years? In classrooms and conference rooms, on trains that run without visible destinations, the answers start to coalesce. A Belgian mining executive has quietly shipped high-grade Congolese ore to New York before the war, a stroke of foresight that will save time nobody can spare. American industry learns to purify graphite until it barely exists as an impurity to itself. The OSRD recruits not just Nobel laureates, but craftsmen who can cut tolerances by feel. The president has decided, the committees have planned, the army is stepping in. The race that began with a letter on Einstein's stationery now wears a hard hat. What began as theory is now a national intention backed by authority. The alarm has been heard. The committees have drawn a map. The go has been given. Next comes the part no equation can simplify. Choosing ground, raising buildings, wiring rivers, and making a continent into a factory that does not admit it exists. The United States is about to build the engine. Building the engine, sites, supply chains, and impossible factories. The green light is followed by ground being broken. Maps are spread across tables, fingers trace rivers and rail lines, slide rules snap open. The country must hide gigantic factories in plain sight, feed them with ore and power, and make their output converge on a weapon no one can describe on a requisition form. Army engineers look for three things: electricity by the gigawatt, water by the river, and distance from prying eyes. Contracts are signed with the speed of field orders. Fences go up before most people inside them know why. East of Knoxville, Tennessee, horse pasture becomes a city with a code name: the Clinton Engineer Works. Oak Ridge to the people who will live there. It is chosen because the Tennessee Valley Authority can pour electricity into it like weather, because rail and road already lace the hills, and because the hollows make good neighbors for secrets. Within months there are numbered gates, alphabet streets, and houses stamped out like parts from a die. Cafeterias appear before sidewalks are finished. Bus lines draw their own map. The badge is a passport. The message on the walls is simple. What you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, leave it here. Into Oak Ridge, the country cranes three different ways to sift a single isotope from its twin. The first to run is electromagnetic separation at Y12, born from Ernest Lawrence's cyclotron work in California. Take uranium, turn it into ions, fire it through a magnetic field. U-235's slightly lighter mass bends a little more than U-238's, allowing operators to collect it in pockets at the edges of the beam. The machines that do this are called calutrons, and the building that houses them looks like a cathedral to magnetism. Racetrack-shaped alpha and beta units as big as neighborhoods. They devour copper by the mile. Copper is scarce in wartime. The solution is as audacious as the project itself. Borrow thousands of tons of silver from the U.S. Treasury and wind it into coils. Silver leaves vaults in bars and returns as wire, stamped, counted, signed for like a state secret because it is one. Y12 runs on discipline as much as electrons. Young women, later nicknamed Calutron girls, watch needles and dials, tuning beams with the light touch of a pianist. They do not need to know the physics to beat the physicists' records. Feedback is instant, and the rules of the game are clear. Keep the beam stable, keep the yield up, keep the uptime near perfect. The process is wasteful by design. Losses are swept up, reprocessed, fed again. Parallel lines make patience into throughput. The product is a trickle, slightly enriched uranium that must be enriched again and again. But a trickle, multiplied by enough machines and enough hours, becomes a stream. Across the ridge rises K25, a building shaped like a giant U, famous for being among the largest under one roof on Earth. Inside, gaseous diffusion does its work. Uranium is combined with fluorine to make a gas, uranium hexafluoride, UF6, that can be pushed through a succession of porous barriers. Each barrier favors, by a hair's breadth, the lighter U-235 molecules. No single stage does much. Thousands of stages in series do everything. The engineering problems are a new species. UF6 is corrosive. Seals must not leak. Barriers must have pore sizes that are both microscopic and uniform. Compressors must run night and day. Chemists and metallurgists invent a materials toolkit for a gas the world barely knew existed. Nickel plating to resist attack, new lubricants that will not react, gaskets made from an exotic polymer. DuPont is learning to scale polytetrafluoroethylene, later known to peacetime as Teflon. An entire company, Kellex, born from the M.W. Kellogg Company, is created to design and coordinate the plant. Machine shops that once made automobile parts now make diffusion cells that stack like a metal forest. A third enrichment path appears like a booster stage, S50, a thermal diffusion plant tucked beside K25. Here, tall columns use temperature gradients to coax the lighter molecules upward. It cannot reach the final concentrations needed for a bomb, but it can nudge the feed that enters K25 and Y12, shaving weeks from a clock that everyone hears in their sleep. The elegance of the larger system is not in any single method. It is in how all three are taught to cooperate, each handing the next a little head start. Oak Ridge is not just a factory town, it is a web of feeder plants that make the project's peculiar ingredients. One plant turns fluorine into an industrial fluid. Another makes barrier material with pores measured in whispers. Another builds power supplies that turn walls into hum. Vendors who once made sewing machines, refrigerators, and radios are asked if they can make something similar but a bit different, and then told what different means only to the extent their part requires. Boxcars arrive with crates addressed to nothing anyone recognizes. Trucks leave with shipments called special, locked and logged with signatures that become their own language. The supply chain is a rope made of 1,000 strands. No one holds the whole rope, and that is the point. 3 time zones away, the landscape changes from hardwood hills to sage and sand. On a bend of the Columbia River in Washington State, the Army and DuPont select an expanse of land big enough to hide entire mistakes. The Hanford Engineer Works. The site has what Oak Ridge has in a different register: deep water, wide power, room to fail far from cities. Electricity flows from great dams on the Columbia. Cold river water promises to carry heat away from machines that will run like controlled stars. The work here is not separation, but transmutation. Reactors that turn U-238 into plutonium-239, and chemical plants that tease that plutonium from irradiated fuel. The first production reactor, later known as B reactor, looks from the outside like a clean-lined industrial box. Inside, it is a precisely bored graphite mountain with hundreds of horizontal tubes. Into those tubes, workers push aluminum-clad uranium slugs. Through the core, cooling water rushes. In the graphite lattice, neutrons bounce and multiply until the machine hums with a steady chain reaction. The element born this way is invisible. Its presence is tracked by counters, its path from core to chemistry measured in time and temperature. After weeks in the reactor, fuel rods are pulled into water basins where their ferocity can cool. Then they travel by shielded rail cars to waiting canyons, long windowless buildings where remote manipulators and cranes, watched through thick glass, dissolve, precipitate and separate until a small volume of solution contains a new metal history has never weighed. Even here, nature is not docile. Early critical runs at Hanford are haunted by an unexpected stall. Reactor power rises and then collapses. The culprit is an isotope of xenon, born in the core, that absorbs neutrons greedily. A poison that temporarily starves the reaction. The fix is both subtle and blunt. Adjust operating procedures and add more fuel channels to outvote the poison. The lesson is clear to everyone who can talk about it. The atom has requirements, and the schedule will meet them, not the other way around. To make Hanford and Oak Ridge breathe, the country builds capillaries at national scale. Uranium ore, much of it quietly stockpiled before the war by a Belgian executive who guessed future needs, becomes oxide, then metal, then gas, then slugs, then solutions, then metals again. Each transformation demanding factories, standards, and new flavors of perfection. Railroads are booked under innocuous pretexts. River barges move crates that do not disclose their contents. Power companies watch their meters spin like propellers and sign agreements that do not say why. Local newspapers learn to admire war work without asking its surname. The Army Corps of Engineers coordinates like a second nervous system. Procurement officers who can conjure pipe by the mile. Construction battalions that turn survey stakes into skylines. Inspectors who understand that a leak is not a nuisance, but a strategic delay. Secrecy is both shield and solvent. Workers at Oak Ridge and Hanford are told what they must know, and most of them accept the terms because the war has made privacy into a luxury. Letters are read before they leave the gates. Cameras are banned. Rumors do the work of posters. For all the surveillance, life beats its drum. Births and marriages, Friday dances, complaints about dust and bus schedules, children learning to ride bicycles on streets that did not exist 6 months before. The project is not only an engineering marvel, but a social one. Instant cities run on schedules as precise as any production line. Money, in a sense, disappears into steel. The contracts are cost plus fixed fee, a formula that allows speed at the price of accounting beauty. DuPont, wary of wartime profit, takes a symbolic fee and shoulders the responsibility for Hanford's risks. Stone and Webster, Union Carbide, Westinghouse, General Electric, Chrysler, Alice Chalmers, names from peacetime shop floors, learn to make devices that operate in temperatures, vacuums, and tolerances they have never sold before. Whole new inspection regimes are born because failure cannot hide in a weapon. It will show itself in a moment no one can afford to see. Not every cost is printed on a ledger. At Oak Ridge, housing and facilities reflect the era's lines, segregated barracks, segregated buses, reminding anyone who looks hard that national unity is not evenly distributed. The project absorbs the labor of tens of thousands of women and men. Many will never know their hands helped build a new era until the newspapers tell them after the fact. Waste and risk are managed by methods invented as they go. Burial grounds mapped in code, effluent diluted by rivers under calculations that will later need revisiting. The speed that wins the race also outruns the time to argue with every consequence. The record will wrestle with that later. What makes this engine impossible is not only its scale, it is how it functions as a single organism. Oak Ridge enriches, Hanford breeds, Chicago's metallurgical laboratory designs reactors and runs a pilot graphite pile, now called X-10, to generate the first grams of plutonium so experimenters at a remote mesa can measure how a real core might behave in a real bomb. Every place is a feeder for every other place. Every shipment is a relay baton. Every delay in one corner echoes in another. Schedules are drafted like invasion plans and redrawn weekly. It is a choreography conducted by people who rarely stand in the same room. And yet, against deadlines, shortages, and the known unknowns of new physics, the engine starts. Y-12 produces its first canisters of enriched material. K-25's long cascade comes online, stage by stage, transforming trickles into streams. S-50 warms the feed. Hanford's reactor sings at power and then, after xenon is tamed, holds the tune. In offices far away, inventories bear code names that translate to futures. On the shop floors, gauges settle where they should, and the hum of machines becomes the sound of time being bent. By the time snow returns to the hills and wind knifes across the sage, America has done something no one has trained for. It has built a continent-wide factory to manufacture an idea. The parts exist. The streams of material are flowing. The engine, unlikely as a city under a mountain, is running. Now the project needs a brain to take what these places produce and turn it into a device that works on the first try, because there may be only one try. That brain sits on a mesa with roads that end at a fence and equations that end at metal. The next chapter opens the door. The brain of the project, Los Alamos and design under pressure. The mesa was chosen for its isolation and its roads that ended in sky. Pinyon and juniper, dry light, a horizon that felt like an empty slate. Los Alamos looked like the right place to ask dangerous questions and make the answers real. The Army fenced the plateau, posted guards at the switchbacks, and handed the keys to a thin, intense theorist who had never run anything larger than a seminar. J. Robert Oppenheimer walked the ridges in a hat in a hurry and set out to do something harder than any equation, make hundreds of brilliant, opinionated people work as one machine under maximum secrecy and minimum time. He did it with clarity and reach. First day, he gathered new arrivals, young PhDs and old masters, and turned the war into a chalk talk. Robert Serber's orientation lectures, later remembered as the Los Alamos Primer, laid it out in plain physics. What fission means, what a chain reaction demands, what a bomb must accomplish in microseconds. Then Oppenheimer built a structure that matched the problem. Theory, T-division, under Hans Bethe to calculate what no instrument could yet measure. Experimental physics, P-division, to make theory bleed into numbers. Explosives, X-division, under George Kistiakowsky to turn shock into geometry. Ordnance, O-division, to tame hardware. Chemistry and metallurgy to coax unstable exotic metals into obedient shapes. And a web of service and computation groups, punch card rooms, drafting tables, machine shops, where speed came by repetition done exactly. At the beginning, two paths were pursued with equal hope. For uranium-235, A gun design looks straightforward. Take two subcritical pieces, fire one into the other down a gun barrel, and cross the critical threshold faster than stray neutrons can spoil the party. The lab called the long, early plutonium gun concept Thin Man, the uranium version Little Boy. But plutonium, born in reactors at Hanford, came with a catch that no one could negotiate away. A small fraction of it, plutonium-240, spits out neutrons on its own. That spontaneous fission makes a gun assembly too slow. The meeting of halves would begin to react before full assembly, fizzing instead of detonating. In the summer of 1944, Los Alamos hit its crisis. The plutonium gun was abandoned. The lab pivoted in a week from line up and fire to surround and crush. Implosion sounded like a single word. It was a library of problems. You had to take a metal core the size of a grapefruit and squeeze it perfectly evenly, all at once by an enormous factor, using chemistry and wiring that had never existed. Explosives do not like to act like lenses. Their shock waves are messy. Oppenheimer gave Kistiakowsky the mandate and the runway. The solution became a marriage of fast and slow explosives stacked in sculpted shapes. Lenses that would convert a ragged outward blast into a converging inward pressure front, the way glass can bend light to a point. Getting that wave perfectly spherical required mathematics as elegant as it was urgent. John von Neumann came up the mountain with pencil proofs for how to shape the lens boundaries, so a fast-slow sandwich, Compo B for speed, baritol for drag, would release a shock that arrived at the core with microsecond unanimity. Unanimity needs a conductor. Ordinary blasting caps jitter too much. A handful of microseconds is an eternity when you need 32 points to sing together. Luis Alvarez and colleagues answered with exploding bridge wire detonators, tiny wires that vaporize into plasma when hit by a sudden pulse of current, initiating the explosive with far less timing scatter. Behind those detonators sat the X unit, a nest of capacitors and therotrons to deliver the pulse to every bridge at once. Miles of identical coaxial cable were cut and measured until their delays matched as if they were the same length of time, not wire. The whole system became an electrical symphony built to play a single chord exactly once. While X division carved lenses and wired the beat, T division probed the heart. What should the core be exactly? Early models imagined a plutonium sphere with a cavity. Then came the insight Robert Christie championed. A Christie pit, nearly solid but engineered in density and impurity to behave under compression as the equations desired. Around it, a tamper pusher of dense metal would reflect neutrons back and hold the compressive wave a breath longer, buying the chain reaction time to bloom. At the center, there had to be a spark at exactly the right instant, a neutron initiator that slept through the pressure wave and awoke at peak compression. Chemists and metallurgists, in a project centered in part at the secret Dayton effort, developed a polonium-beryllium urchin, a spiky little device that, when crushed, mixed its poisons to emit a hard burst of neutrons right when the core needed ignition. How do you test a thing you cannot fire often and cannot afford to guess about? Los Alamos invented a zoo of hydrodynamic experiments, shots using mock cores of natural uranium, copper, or aluminum, whose behavior under high explosives mimicked the flow of a real core without producing nuclear yield. Fast cameras and radiography watched metal move at miles per second. The Rala program, radiolanthanum, hid a hot lanthanum 140 source at the center of test assemblies. Ionization detectors outside, watched gamma rays dim as shock-compressed material became denser. Each shot taught the lensmakers where the wave buckled, where it arrived early or late, where eddies, Rayleigh-Taylor instabilities, threatened to turn a neat sphere into a crown of failure. Each week, machines were recut, casting methods revised, gaps shimmed away. Try, measure, adjust became a religion with explosives for hymns. The human tempo matched the physics. Days started with colloquia, where Oppenheimer roamed the blackboards like a conductor, translating between disciplines so that a chemist could hear what a mathematician meant and a machinist could see why a tenth of a millimeter mattered to a physicist. Afternoons belonged to shops and shot towers, to the tang of cordite and the whine of lathes. Nights were for calculations, rooms hot with Marchant and Friden calculators, stacks of IBM punch cards clacking through tabulators, young mathematicians checking cross-sections and shock timings until the paper curled under their elbows. Security men walked the corridors. So did babies in prams and dogs chasing dust. There were cribbage games at Fuller Lodge, strings quartets in living rooms, lectures on Sanskrit and Dante because the director could quote both and liked to see minds breathe. There were also posted guards with clipped voices, ID badges that had to be worn, letters opened before they left the hill, and a constant sense, part thrill, part weight, that the world outside was guessing at a secret and you were the guess. Groves and Oppenheimer formed a duet of opposites that worked because each needed the other. Groves was granite and urgency, a builder of dams who now moved laboratories like regiments, skeptical of loose talk and allergic to drift. Oppenheimer was speed and synthesis, able to make a room believe a new plan before lunch and assign it before dinner. Groves had doubts about his director's past politics, but backed him anyway once the work began, defending him to security men because the project needed a translator and a spark. Oppie, for his part, learned to live with Army rhythms and used them, deadlines as metronomes, milestones as morale, to keep the lab pointed toward a device and a date. There were detours and scrapes. The lab planned a massive steel container called Jumbo to catch the pieces in case the first full-scale test fizzled. As confidence grew, it became insurance nobody wanted to need, and ultimately a relic more than a tool. There were false starts. The plutonium gun set aside with a kind of grief for sunk work, lens geometries that promised purity and delivered chaos, castings that cracked because a new metal had old habits. There were safety lines drawn and redrawn as the lab learned to live with polonium, beryllium dust, and the sting of bared sources. There were near misses with detonators and stray currents that taught electricians and physicists to trust the same ground rules. Through it all, the lab did something atypical for wartime secrecy. Inside the fence, Oppenheimer pushed for openness, wide seminars, shared data, arguing that compartmentalization is slower than trust when the enemy is the clock. As Hanford's first plutonium shipments began to cross the desert under code names and armed eyes, Los Alamos felt time narrow. With real material in hand, measurements replaced assumptions. Neutron lifetimes and multiplication factors shifted from paper to counters. Metallurgists learned how plutonium ages, allotropes creeping from phase to phase like a metal with moods. Alloying with a touch of gallium steadied it. Machinists invented ways to work a toxic, delicate element into precise shells without ruining pieces no one could replace quickly. The gadget, as the first complete implosion assembly was called, moved from drawings to parts with a specificity that made the skin prickle. each hemisphere tracked, each detonator serialized, each cable cut to length with the reverence of a violin string. Meanwhile, the uranium gun path marched with the calm of a simpler plan. Los Alamos built and bench-fired gun assemblies with inert bullets and targets, proving the mechanics' timing and safety interlocks. They resisted the temptation to test a fully active little boy because enriched uranium was too rare to spend on a rehearsal and because the physics said the method would work if built exactly. That division of risk, test the complicated one, trust the simple, was not bravado. It was triage in a resource economy measured in grams and days. Culture and conscience lived side by side with craft. Some scientists, particularly after the tide of war turned in Europe, began to ask what success would mean, how many cities, how many lives, and drafted petitions about demonstration shots, about the post-war control of the atom. Others hardened their focus. If we fail, the war goes on. If we succeed, perhaps it ends. Oppenheimer felt both winds. He pressed the work with a gambler's intensity and read poetry at night that refused triumph without cost. By early summer 1945, the Mesa had pulled its threads tight. Lens blocks were machined and mated, their interfaces burnished until no air would admit it had been there. Detonators were tested until their timing histograms collapsed into a single narrow peak. The initiator aged on a clock of its own and was assembled at the last possible breath. The firing circuits were rehearsed on dummies, then sealed. Boxes left the hill under guard and desert light, heading south to a place that had borrowed a name, Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man, and a tower that waited for a device bolted like a dark fruit to a steel cradle. The brain on the Mesa had done what it was built to do, turn physics into a machine that would either fail spectacularly or change the century before breakfast. What remains just before the dawn is a kind of held note. Theory has been hammered into tooling, and tooling has been taught to behave on command. The gadget stands not as a promise, but as a question that only a flash can answer. In the next chapter, the Mesa's work meets the wider war's uncertainty, the other race unfolding in Europe's shadow, the intelligence that set the pace, and the decisions that will decide whether this device is demonstration, warning, or weapon. The other race, intelligence, sabotage, and strategic uncertainty. The Manhattan Project was a race, but not one run in open lanes or on the same track. Across the Atlantic, a different program stirred in laboratories shielded by blackout curtains and barbed wire. Its outlines were smudged by secrecy, rumor, and wishful thinking, and that ambiguity shaped decisions on the American side as surely as equations did. Intelligence turned into a metronome. Every report from Europe either tightened or eased the tempo, and sometimes both at once. The first signal came with the physics itself. Fission had been announced in German journals. The scientists who named and explained it had German colleagues. Germany controlled industrial territories and, after 1940, much of Europe's laboratories and mines. If anyone could reach for the atom in wartime, the United States assumed Germany could. That assumption, conservative, fearful, prudent, became policy. It would take years of espionage, sabotage, and captured papers to learn that the German path was not a sprint, but a shuffle. Britain, fighting for breath under the Blitz, made the first hard cut through the fog. Its tube alloys program assembled a small, brilliant committee, Peierls, Frisch, Chadwick, Oliphant, and asked questions in the way only a pressed island can. What mass is needed? How could one separate isotopes? What does feasible mean when sirens are wailing? Their OIU'd report concluded that a bomb was not a fantasy. It could be built in time to matter. That judgment, carried by diplomatic pouch and personal persuasion to Washington, changed the American problem from, "Is this real?" to "How fast?" It also set the stage for a union. The 1943 Quebec Agreement, which fused British and American atomic efforts under a common policy and a joint committee, with British scientists embedded at Los Alamos and American factories, bent to a shared end. The alliance cut both ways. Technical insight for continental muscle and intelligence flowed with it. What Britain learned about German intentions became American tempo. Germany's intentions, however, were a moving target. Early German experiments were led by first-rank names: Werner Heisenberg, Otto Hahn, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker. But the German program, the Uhrenverein, made choices that turned out to be cul-de-sacs. Graphite moderators failed because impurities, boron measured in parts per million, gobbled neutrons. German chemists concluded wrongly that graphite was unsuitable. They turned instead to heavy water as the moderator of choice. Heavy water was not a poor choice. It was a poor choice in wartime Europe. There was one main source, Norsk Hydro's plant at Vemork in occupied Norway, and that bottleneck became a target. The story of heavy water is the story of small teams changing a continent's future in the dark. In 1942, a bold but ill-starred British glider assault, Operation Freshman, crashed on ice and ended in tragedy, with surviving commandos executed by the Gestapo. The lesson was grim but specific. Stealth would have to do what mass could not. In February 1943, a handful of Norwegian saboteurs, trained in Scotland, parachuted into winter, skied and climbed into the plant, infiltrated the basement, laid charges with a watchmaker's care, and slipped away before the blast unmanned the pipes. Operation Gunnerside destroyed the key cells that concentrated deuterium. Months later, American bombers cratered the site. When the Germans tried to move remaining stocks and equipment by ferry across Lake Tinn, Norwegian resistance planted explosives in the SF Hydro. The ferry went down in icy water in February 1944, along with the drums. Every stage of that saga had a message for Washington and London. If Germany's path to a moderated reactor runs through Vemork, then cut the path. Intelligence did not only inform, it sculpted reality. Still, the Americans could not live on sabotage alone. They wanted to know what Heisenberg and company were doing in their notebooks, what their experiments had measured, what their leaders believed possible. So they built a hybrid instrument, part military raid, part scientific audit, called Alsos. Under Colonel Boris Pasch in the field, and physicist Samuel Goudsmit as scientific lead, Alsos teams followed armies, slipping into newly liberated cities with lists and Geiger counters. In Italy, they found fragments of effort. In France, they traced shipments and conversations. In Strasbourg, in late 1944, they seized papers that read like a progress report from the other lane of the track. They discovered that Germany's work was real but small. Reactor experiments, calculations on critical masses, no sprawling industrial plant for isotope separation. The relief this brought was edged with urgency. If the other side was not close, the war's clock still was. The Alsos mission ended like a detective story with an empty room that explained everything. In April 1945, as the Allies crossed into southwestern Germany, Alsos rolled into the towns of Hakingen and Heigerloch and found the German reactor, spheres and cubes of uranium hung like a brutalist chandelier in a tank of heavy water, lodged in a cavern beneath a church. It had not achieved criticality. Nearby were barrels of heavy water and notebooks with algebra that trailed off into more required. Heisenberg and his colleagues were detained. Later they would be spirited to an English country house wired with hidden microphones, Operation Epsilon, where their surprise at Hiroshima would be recorded for posterity. Their words said in private what America had already learned by pry bar and cable. The German bomb was an ambition starving on logistics and organization. Intelligence did more than reduce fear. It sharpened bets inside the American project. When reports suggested that Germany had not mastered isotope separation, the Manhattan leadership felt permission to keep hedging, electromagnetic, diffusion, thermal, without the panic of a mirrored plant racing them day for day. When the heavy water saga confirmed the German reliance on a single moderator, American chemists redoubled work on ultra-pure graphite and reactor design, comforted that the home team's moderator supply, carbon and ingenuity, could scale faster. When Alsos concluded that Germany was nowhere near a weapon, decision-makers began to see the bomb less as a shield against Berlin and more as a lever in the war against Tokyo and the world that would follow it. The object's physics did not change, its political mass did. The British-American fusion of science was an intelligence coup of its own. James Chadwick arrived in America with a quiet authority that came from discovering the neutron. As head of the British mission, he cleared paths and soothed egos. John Cockcroft and Mark Oliphant brought accelerator savvy and laboratory steel. Rudolf Peierls brought the paper logic that made implosion sound inevitable before it was workable. They also brought a risk history would only later render in full. Among them were men, Klaus Fuchs most notably, who secretly reported to the Soviet Union. That was an other race of a different kind, running perpendicular to the German one, and its consequences would shape the post-war world. But inside the wartime project, what mattered day to day was that British eyes made American hands move faster and straighter. Shared math became shared machines. Uncertainty, meanwhile, demanded contingency. What if Germany used radioactive material as a battlefield terror? The United States quietly prepared Operation Peppermint, a plan to detect and respond to radiological sabotage during the invasion of France. What if Germany evacuated scientists and stocks eastward as its lines collapsed? Alsos accelerated, sending detachments to chase trucks, guard railheads, and search salt mines whose tunnels hid surprises. In one such mine, American teams found uranium stocks stashed like treasure. In others, they pried crates of documents from damp racks and watched ink that had been dangerous dry into history. Even intelligence that reassured could not be allowed to slow the build. Groves and Bush, Roosevelt, and then Truman all understood the paradox. If you relax because the other runner seems to be behind, you may only lose unseen. The Manhattan Project therefore treated good news as a morale stabilizer, not a throttle. Yes, Germany was behind. No, that did not change the delivery dates for Oak Ridge canisters or Hanford slugs or Los Alamos assemblies. It did, however, alter the psychology of use. By the time Trinity's tower rose on the Jornada, the Nazi threat had collapsed and the target set, strategic, ethical, diplomatic, shifted toward Japan and the shape of a peace no one trusted. There was also the matter of knowing when done meant enough. Intelligence officers sat in briefings with weapon designers, explaining what Alsos had found in Europe while learning what a tamper did or why a detonator's jitter mattered. That cross-pollination, rare in the pre-war world, became a norm. Soldiers who could parse a cross-section, physicists who could read a map like a sergeant. When the final decisions on testing and use approached, the bridges between information and engineering were already built. They carried not only facts, but judgment, a sense for how the other race had run and what the finish line might mean. In the longer arc, the intelligence war wrote a rough draft of the nuclear age's rules. Cooperation under the Quebec Agreement foreshadowed joint control and later joint friction over atomic secrets. Sabotage against heavy water demonstrated that small, precise actions could steer grand technologies. Alsos taught that scientific capability is information before it is metal, and that the surest way to measure an adversary's reach is to read their lab notebooks and their purchase orders, not their speeches. And the farm hall transcripts, with their astonishment and rationalizations, reminded victors and vanquished alike that brilliance without industry is a sketch. Industry without coordination is a rumor. Coordination without purpose is nothing at all. As the desert morning approached at Trinity, the other race had largely been won in the way the Americans most wanted it to be. Not by outpacing a rival neck and neck, but by learning that the rival never found the track. That knowledge, bought by men on skis and men with briefcases, by pilots who flew at low altitude over a Norwegian gorge, and by soldiers who searched caves with flashlights, fed back into a single hard conclusion. The clock was still the clock. The German program might not beat it, but the war would run until someone stopped it. In that knowledge, the hands did not slow. They steadied. What followed would braid the strands together, experimental triumph, military decision, moral argument, into a single, irreversible action. Intelligence had set the pace, sabotage had narrowed the risk, alliances had multiplied strength. Now the question left was the simplest and heaviest. Does it work? And if it does, what then? Countdown, Trinity, decision, Hiroshima/Nagasaki, and the petitions. Before desert dawn, the project that began with chalk and rumors stands assembled on steel. The plutonium gadget, wired like a nervous system and wrapped in lenses that learn to focus shock, is hoisted to the top of a 100-foot tower on the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man. At the McDonald Ranch House, miles away, men in khaki and denim check circuits and argue with stopwatches. The device has a simple purpose dressed in terrifying complexity. Hold its breath, compress perfectly, and let neutrons multiply faster than a human can blink. It has taken a ladder of milestones to reach this morning. Back in Chicago, under the stone bleachers of Stagg Field, Enrico Fermi's team stacked graphite and uranium into a careful pile, and on December 2, 1942, coaxed the first controlled self-sustaining chain reaction from matter. That trick, achieved with counters clicking like sparrows, proved reactors could be built. Reactors made plutonium possible. Plutonium made implosion necessary. Oak Ridge enriched U-235 to feed a simpler gun device. Hanford bred Pu-239 to feed the machine on the tower. Los Alamos turned both streams into weapons in parallel because time had outlawed single bets. The night is sour with desert dust and condenser hum. Weather matters. A thunderstorm rolls through after midnight, delicate wires worrying under wind. Around 5 a.m. on July the 16th, 1945, The air steadies and the countdown begins. Men lie in trenches or behind blast shields, hands over dark glasses. Others huddle around oscilloscope traces that will tell a story in microseconds. At 5:29:45, the switch is thrown. Current surges, bridge wires flash to plasma, lenses detonate, a steel globe is crushed with mathematical fury, and the desert acquires a second sun. A white-violet core expands into fire that pulls shadows toward it, a shock front races outward, arrives with a slap, and the tower's footprint puddles into green glass called trinitite. The yield, about 21 kilotons, will be argued over decimals for decades. The meaning is instantly plain. Kenneth Bainbridge, who ran the test site, turns to Oppenheimer and says what everyone feels: now we are all sons of bitches. What follows is a different kind of compression, technical certainty collapsing into political decision. 2 months earlier, the Interim Committee, a civilian group chaired by Secretary of War Henry Stimson, with scientific advisors Vannevar Bush, James Conant, Carl Compton, and a scientific panel of Oppenheimer, Compton, Fermi, and Lawrence, had been considering how and whether to use the bomb. Their charge was not theoretical. It was tactical, strategic, and moral. End the war. Weigh invasion losses against new horror. Think, if possible, about the world that would inherit this act. Views diverged. At the University of Chicago's Metallurgical Laboratory, a committee led by James Frank produced a report in June urging a demonstration on an uninhabited site before any use against cities, warning that surprise would poison any hope of international control. Leo Szilard, whose 1939 letter had helped start the race, drafted a petition in July urging President Truman not to use the weapon without warning. Ralph Bard, Undersecretary of the Navy, suggested advance notice to Japan. Others, looking at casualty projections for an invasion of Kyushu and Honshu, at the ferocity of battles on Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and at the deadly daily arithmetic of firebombing and blockade, concluded that a decisive blow might force surrender faster than any alternative. The scientific panel, after hearing arguments and seeing no guarantee that a demonstration would end the war, advised use against a war plant surrounded by workers' housing, recognizing that workers' housing is a phrase that fails to hide civilians. Trinity does not settle ethics. It settles feasibility. On July 26th in Potsdam, the United States, Britain, and China issue a proclamation calling for Japan's unconditional surrender, warning of prompt and utter destruction without naming its physics. Tokyo's leadership is divided between those who court negotiated peace and those who will fight city to city. The Soviet Union is poised to break the Neutrality Pact and enter the Pacific War. In Tinian, in the Marianas, ground crews and weaponeers move along checklists that have no precedent. The uranium bomb, Little Boy, is the simpler path. No test required because the physics is inexorable if the mechanics hold. At Site Baker on Tinian, ordnance teams fit the gun-type assembly together, arm it with its slug and target, and hand it to the 509th Composite Group. In the early hours of August 6, 1945, Colonel Paul Tibbets names his B-29 for his mother, Enola Gay, and lifts off with a crew trained to be methodical through shock. Weather planes scout the target cities. Hiroshima is clear. At 8:15 a.m. local time, the bomb falls, ticking through fuses and barometric triggers, and detonates at about 1,900 feet over the city center. In less than a second, wooden homes and paper walls vanish into flame. Steel bridges twist, Shadows brand themselves on steps. A shock wave scythes outward. A thermal pulse strips paint and skin. Estimates vary and will always vary, but by year's end, perhaps 140,000 human beings are dead, many instantly, many by burns and acute radiation sickness in the days and weeks that follow. Hospitals themselves are leveled, doctors become patients, survivors, hibakusha, walk under a black rain that turns soil to ink. Back in Washington, cables move with the solemnity of fate. The emperor and his ministers weigh a peace that saves the throne against a war that may erase it. Tokyo's response is not surrender. The clock does not pause. A second mission is set for August 11th, then moved up to the 9th because of weather. The plutonium implosion bomb, Fat Man, is heavier, fussier, and deadlier on paper. Major Charles Sweeney pilots Boxcar with a crew that will navigate through error and contingency. A rendezvous gone wrong, a fuel pump problem, clouds blocking the primary target, Kokura. They turn toward the secondary, Nagasaki, a city whose rivers stitch neighborhoods into a bowl. At 11:02 a.m., the bomb detonates above the Urakami Valley. The yield again is on the order of 21 kilotons. The terrain spares parts of the city even as it dooms others. Industrial sites are hit, neighborhoods erased. By year's end, perhaps 70,000 are dead. The numbers are crude instruments for what happened in seconds, losses spread over time by burns that will not heal, marrow that fails, pregnancies that end in grief. Between the two bombings, the Soviet Union declares war on Japan August 8th and invades Manchuria, dismantling Tokyo's last diplomatic hope of playing great powers against each other. Inside the Imperial Palace, the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, military and civilian leaders, deadlocks. The unthinkable happens. Emperor Hirohito intervenes, breaking precedent to call for acceptance of the Potsdam terms on the condition that the throne be preserved. Even then, the end threatens to tear itself apart. A group of officers attempts a coup to stop the surrender broadcast. They fail. On August 15th, the emperor's voice reaches his people by radio for the first time, a recorded address written in courtly language that does not say defeat, but means it. We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all the generations to come. The formal surrender is signed aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd. The war that began with carriers and treaties ends with signatures and a physics lesson no one can unread. While decisions hardened into missions, the petitions and reports did not disappear. They echoed. Groves kept Seilard's petition from Truman's desk, funneling it instead into file drawers and post-war controversy. The Frank report would, after the fact, look prophetic about the diplomatic costs of surprise. The interim committee's minutes would be combed for alternative paths, demonstrations on an empty atoll, a warning strike near Tokyo Bay, modification of unconditional surrender, and for the reasoning that ruled them out. What if a demonstration fizzled? What if it convinced rather than coerced? What if time and weather and chance turned an intended signal into a shrug? Within the project, conscience took forms as varied as its people. Some felt relief. A terrible weapon had ended a more terrible war. Some felt a shock that did not fade. Oppenheimer told a room in Los Alamos, "The work is done." He also later told President Truman he felt he had blood on his hands. Truman disliked the remark and the man for it. Others turned immediately to control, fresh committees urging an international authority over atomic energy. proposals to place the secret, which no longer was won, in a framework that might keep it from becoming a normal instrument of national power. The ink was barely dry on surrender documents when a new race, colder and longer, began to outline itself against the horizon. Counting even now does not close the subject. Casualty estimates for an invasion ranged widely. The bombing's role relative to the Soviet entry is debated by scholars and remembered differently by those who lived under the mushroom clouds and those who waited on transport ships. What is not in dispute is sequence. Trinity proved the device. Hiroshima and Nagasaki proved the world had changed. Surrender followed days later. Nor is there dispute about speed. From the first controlled chain reaction to 2 operational weapons took 31 months. The project had been designed to bend time. In its endgame, it succeeded terribly and exactly. When the desert light returned to ordinary color after Trinity, the men and women on the line exhaled into a world they had helped make. In a sense, the Manhattan Project's countdown never stopped. It ran forward into occupation policies, medical surveys of survivors, debates about classification and disclosure, the creation of the Atomic Energy Commission, and the first diplomatic plans for keeping the genie in a bottle with no known neck. But in those 10 August days, the metronome that had ruled laboratories and factories tapped out a last fateful beat. Test, ultimatum, use, surrender. The race had been against a rival and against history's pace. The bomb turned out to be ahead of both. The petitions, like the photographs, remain as witness. They record that even inside a machine built for speed, there were hands raised with questions, that a nation capable of compressing science and industry into months was also capable of arguing with itself in the middle of the work. The arguments did not stop the countdown. They did, however, define the moral weather the project left behind. In the blast's afterglow, both victory and warning were visible, and neither could cancel the other. Finale: what it took and what it changed. It took a nation learning to move like a single hand. Ore hauled from quiet warehouses and distant mines, rivers turned into engines, whole towns raised in weeks, their streets named by letters and their lives by shifts. It took silver from vaults, copper wound into thunder, graphite purified until a trace of boron became a national problem. It took machinists who could feel 1/10 of a millimeter, chemists who could coax new elements into behaving, soldiers who could build cities and keep their names off maps, and scientists willing to translate chalk into metal on a schedule that measured failure in lives. It took secrecy so tight that neighbors built pieces of a future without knowing its outline, and discipline enough that the pieces met in a desert and worked the first time. It also took a bet on organization, committees that became an office that became a project that became a continent-wide factory with a brain on a mesa. Parallel paths ran not because planners loved redundancy, but because time punishes single bets: electromagnetic, diffusion, thermal, uranium and plutonium, theory and tooling, shop and seminar. Each raced the others so the whole could beat the clock. The lesson is uncomfortable and true. Speed at this scale is not an accident, it is designed. What changed was more than a war's timetable. Trinity, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki proved that physics could end arguments in a morning, and that victory could arrive carrying a warning. In days, Japan surrendered. In weeks, occupation policy and medical surveys began. In months, a democracy that had built the world's most secret enterprise argued in the open about what to do next. In 1946, Congress placed the atom under civilian authority, creating the Atomic Energy Commission and replacing military orders with public law. The Baruch Plan proposed international control. It failed, and a different kind of race began. Secrets that had been shared with Britain in war were narrowed by statute in peace. Elsewhere, espionage had already moved drawings across frontiers. The age that followed would swing between stockpiles and treaties, tests and bans, an uneasy stewardship of power that could not be uninvented. The Manhattan Project also rewired American possibility. It made big science a national language, laboratories that outlived the war, procurement and quality systems that became templates, computing rooms that foreshadowed a coming logic of machines, a partnership of universities, industry, and government that would later send instruments into orbit and astronauts to the moon. It taught that logistics is a form of strategy, that information is as decisive as steel, and that the skills of carpenters and code breakers can intersect in a single device. It showed that moral argument does not stop the assembly line, but it follows the product wherever it goes. The costs were counted in more than budgets. In Japan, the dead and the scarred carried proof of what fission means when it enters a city. In the United States, workers remembered their oaths and later their diagnoses. Rivers and deserts absorbed wastes no one had language for yet. Segregated buses ran on streets built for a victory that did not include everyone evenly. The project ended a war. It did not resolve the contradictions of the country that built it. Those would require other kinds of work, slower and just as stubborn. And yet the central lesson remains, visible in blueprints and minutes and glass fused into green on a desert floor. When science, logistics, and purpose align, time can be bent. A problem thought to belong to future decades was compressed into 30 months by a coalition that matched clarity to resources and tolerated no drift. That is a power to handle carefully. Used well, it vaccinates a continent, bridges a river, lands a probe on a distant world. Used poorly, it accelerates harm with unprecedented efficiency. The race that began in fear ended in capability, and capability became responsibility. From the moment the second sun rose over Jornada del Muerto, every decision about the atom carried two clocks, one that measured what could be done, and one that asked what should. The Manhattan Project beat the first with a perfection that changed the century. The second clock is still running.